wasting money on cures. Forgot how to fix myself. They say that time is free. Then why is it so precious? Oh, I'll say memories in my head, like Polaroids on walls. They remind you to look ahead. Time is running out. Time is running out. Lately I've lost my track. I've sailed the deeper seas, hoping to find something to bring back better times. Oh, I'll say memories in my head, like Polaroids on walls. They remind you to look ahead. But time is running out. 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 Time is running. Time is running out. Time is running out. What if my best days are over? They can't be over. They can't be over now. Time is running out. What if my best days are over? They can't be over now. Time is running out. Time is running out. Time is running out.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our live stream ahead of the macro paper tomorrow. I hope you're well, and thanks for joining in. Hundreds of people joining us on the live stream, and I'm sure many more will join us on replay. Now, if you're subscribed to the channel, then you can also contribute to our amazing chat window. So consider doing that if you are not at the moment a member of our subscription channel. We're going to look at three main policies today: fiscal, monetary and supply side. The emphasis is going to be on the UK economy. So the macro papers tomorrow. I know when I mark macro papers, as I'm doing this year, that I really appreciate students who just can show that understanding, that awareness of where the UK economy is and in sort of wider context. And also you have specifics. So our aim in this next 30 minutes or so is to really drill down into some specifics, stuff that you won't forget before tomorrow. And then hopefully you'll be able to use it, because macro policies, monetary, fiscal, supply side, they always come up in some shape or form. Let's crack on. Let's think about the UK economy in the broader sense. Again, I'm really interested in your ideas and thoughts here. So a minute on the clock here. What do you think are the main challenges, the main issues, the salient problems facing the UK economy as you head into your macro paper? Let's have a look at the chat window as we go through. We'll pick out some of the best answers. Let's start the clock. So what do we think? What are some of the salient issues? Because you can bet your last dollar that the examiners think in similar ways. Some great answers coming through. Thank you. Some amazing answers coming through on the chat window. Okay, some great stuff coming through. Thank you to everybody. We'll pick out a few more. Anna's gone for lack of investment. Quite a few of you talking about high levels of debt, low growth, inactivity very high, persistent current account deficit. This is really excellent, really excellent. Well, lots of things there. Productivity, youth unemployment, strained trade relationships, aging population. Baxter talks about fragile consumer confidence. And Amir talks about income inequality. In other words, a whole smorgasbord of economic issues facing the UK. And typically, examiners choose those kind of topics. Just a quick few words from me. Labour's policy priority is now clear. It's faster growth. Okay, but the estimated trend growth for the UK, the long-term growth of productive potential, is now around 1.5%. Now, that's simply not enough for any government really to drive living standards higher, and any government wants to bring down the debt. The fiscal inheritance of the Labour government was poor by most criteria, a high and rising national debt, very high levels of fiscal deficit, and a 70-year high for the tax burden, although that's going up still further. I want to make the point that in the last couple of years, we've had lots of exam questions about inflation, about the cost of living crisis, that kind of stuff. Well, inflation's come down a lot, as we'll see, but the consequences, the impact of the cost of living crisis are still being felt. Put simply, since 2015, so in the last 10 years, consumer prices across the board have risen by 30%. So that you can work out the average there. And inflation remains above target. We'll talk about the Bank of England in a few minutes, very cautious in cutting interest rates. A lot of you in the chat window talked about national debt being high, which is true, but also there's a lot of other debt to think about. So think more holistically. Very high levels of corporate, local council debt, and also household debt. And quite a few of you were talking about supply side weaknesses, which was great to see. Low investment from Anna, productivity gaps, rising inactivity, and a very high level of working poverty. Alongside the trade frictions and the strained trade relationships between the UK and the European Union, and obviously latterly with the United States. So let's have a think about these things in terms of the broad impact. Labour is clear. This is why I think economic growth is something you should revise today. As Rachel Reeves said at the start of this year, there's no substitute for growth. It's the only way to create more jobs, put money in people's pockets. It's at the heart of our plan for change. And we're going to finish our session today by looking in detail at supply side policies. So that's their aim. The reality, though, is that growth, as we see on the next slide, is somewhat anemic. So this is the growth chart for the UK since 2007. You can see the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, a period of steady growth after that. Then the pandemic, we lost 10% of GDP in 1 year. Then the recovery, the rebound in 2021. But since then, the UK economy has settled at a fairly low growth equilibrium. Okay, in other words, we're settled at around 1.5%, 2%, which simply isn't enough. We need to be growing by more than that. But the challenge is how to get there. And moving forward, examiners, they understand this. So the next slide, basically, let's take the chart and shift it over. According to the ONS data, GDP growth was 3% per year between 1993 and 2007. Between 2009 and 2023, it's only been 1.5%. So the growth rate of the UK economy has halved. And if you account for population growth, GDP per person in real terms last year was still below what it was before the pandemic. So there's a risk of a lost decade of living standards. What I've tried to do there is just think about 3 possible 25 markers. Evaluate the effects of slow growth on the other macro objectives in the UK. Could you answer that? To what extent is monetary policy more effective than fiscal policy in stimulating growth in the UK? Could you have a good go at that? And evaluate the view that the main objective of the UK government should be faster economic growth. Those are the kind of exam style questions that typically get asked in this kind of area. Moving forward, so growth has been slow, inflation has come down. Now keep in mind that 2023-24, a lot of exam questions were about what was happening in 2022. Inflation averaged 9%, Of course, it reached 11% in October of 22. Then we've had the disinflation, inflation dropping back down towards below 3% last year. But the fear is it goes up this year before dropping back to target, obviously falls to target over the next 3 or 4 years. So inflation is lower, but keep in mind, please, that living costs are so much higher. So people are having to adjust to a significant increase in the cost of living. Inflation's come down, but prices are still rising less quickly. Some great contributions in the chat window as we digest some of those questions, and we will come back to some of these thoughts in a second or two. The other side which is worth showing is unemployment. There hasn't really been much on unemployment in recent times in the macro papers. Growth and unemployment have been, by and large, not shifted out of sight, but they've been bystanders. So again, expect some sort of focus on unemployment, which by and large has come down over the last 15, 20 years, but is now creeping up again towards 4.5%. Okay, so let's drill into some detail here. The other thing I just wanted to mention was business confidence. Quite a few of you mentioned fragile confidence. If we can look at the next chart, I follow the British Chamber of Commerce survey quite closely. And this is basically, if you've revised Keynesian economics and revised the theory of animal spirits and that kind of stuff, these are the main concerns of businesses. Quarterly data, and I've got the data up to and including the end of March. And you can see that for most businesses, it's tax and inflation that still remain the main issues. I mean, to a lesser extent, business rates, competition in markets, the currency and interest rates, they are not of no concern, but it's tax and inflation that has dominated business thinking. Of course, most businesses don't trade. So most domestic businesses are domestic for a reason. They don't trade. Okay, so let's move on in terms of our focus. I want to spend about 5 or 6 minutes on each of the main policies, if that's okay, in our time together. So let's think about fiscal policy. I had a student the other day said, right, during the live streams, I have my notes in front of me, and I'm always looking just to add in the odd bit of detail. With the exam so close, that's a good strategy. So if you've got your fiscal policy notes to hand, maybe some written notes or some flashcards, let's spend 5 minutes on this. What do you think are some of the main fiscal policy issues facing the UK now? We'll try and pick up half a dozen of them in the chat window onto the screen. Let's have a go. So what are some of the big fiscal policy issues? What can you come up with? And it's great to see some new contributors here. Great evaluative point there from Tom. Rachel's self-imposed fiscal rules. Yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute, Giles, actually, whether those rules should be changed or will be changed. Some great comments here. Fiscal drag, fiscal deficit. Wow, this is a level of knowledge and awareness which is going to be amazing for tomorrow. Yeah, Ibrahim talking about the essential trade-off there. If we can pick up a few more, everybody. This is coming through so quickly. We've got well over 1,000 people now in the live stream. So keep an eye on the screen, but also follow the chat. Don't forget, this session is recorded. You'll be able to download the presentation straight away afterwards. If you want a bit of revision. What have we come here? Tom Perry says, high national debt leaves a burden for future generations. Wow. Damages international credit ratings. I think just yesterday, Tom, the USA lost its AAA rating. Really good stuff. Fantastic. Danny talks about higher national insurance increasing the cost of labour. Controversial decision, that one, in terms of increasing to 15%. Henry Jackson goes for a higher national debt of over 100% of GDP, and then brings in Ricardian equivalence theory, making spending ineffective at stimulating demand. So in other words, is the idea that if you borrow more today, people expect higher taxes in the future. James Brooks reminds us that the UK now has a AA rating. Thanks for that, James. So what we're doing today, we're topping up on fiscal policy, and I am in awe. I am literally in awe at the quality of the points. Well, okay, let's think about some issues here again. If it's okay with you, a couple of minutes from me. Yeah, I think Giles was hinting at this, that fiscal policy basically is treading a tightrope. The government wants to improve fiscal discipline and fiscal position, but it's got multiple economic and social challenges. So we have a level of national debt of 100% of GDP, which in itself isn't necessarily a problem, but a fiscal deficit is still well above forecast. Quite a few of you mentioned tax. Highest tax burden for over 70 years. If you take all the taxes together, direct, indirect, income and wealth, all that kind of stuff, it's 43% of GDP. Taxation, 43% of GDP this year, which is the highest for 70 years. And believe me, I was almost there 70 years ago. The decision to raise national insurance to 15% from 13.5%, quite controversial in a sense. Some people call it a jobs tax, but actually it only takes it back to where it was before. I think the bigger issue is the decision to cut the wage that you start paying employers' national insurance at to something like $5,000. So a lot more small businesses are going to have to pay. The government's trying to reduce welfare spending, as we'll see in a second. They're trying to shave $6 billion off the welfare bill. How do you do that? Is the winter fuel payment the right choice? There is clearly a lot of pressure on the NHS, huge pressure post-pandemic. Will the extra spending be enough, or will they need to bring in the private sector? We know there's a lot of pressure to raise defence spending. Government's committed to 2.5% of GDP. Overseas aid seems to be taking the hit. And Giles hinted at this point, so this is the point I wanted to come back to. There's a big debate over whether the government should change their own rules to increase borrowing to fund investment. Now, before they came into power, the Labour government decided not to change income tax, VAT, or your national insurance for the lifetime of this parliament. That, in many ways, has hemmed them in, is acting as a big constraint. So lots of issues on fiscal policy. The next slide, basically, let's look at the big picture. So income tax is the biggest source of tax revenue this year, just under £1 billion a day, then VAT, then national insurance. So know your big taxes. A lot of students expecting questions on corporation tax. It does bring in £2 billion a week, but it's a shadow of what VAT brings in, for example. So that's what the government gets in tax. The next slide shows what they spend the money on. Now, welfare, this is worth noting, welfare is nearly £400 billion a year now. It's over £1 billion a day on welfare. It's called social protection. That's the pension. It's universal credit. Healthcare, rising 277, education 146. But look at number 4, debt interest. So the government is spending over £2 billion a week on just paying the interest on the debt. And a lot of you were saying the opportunity cost factor comes in there. Defence 83 billion, transport 66. So there is huge pressure on government spending. You know, where do you find those kind of cuts if you need to cut them? The government is spending more than it's receiving in tax. So our next slide shows the fiscal deficit. So this is how much the government borrowed, a stat to use in the exam. The deficit was 315 billion in 1 year in 2020-21. Of course, the pandemic and the furlough scheme in large part a reflection of that, the extra spending of the NHS. But notice here the deficit is remaining above £120 billion a year, and it's forecast to rise. At the moment, it's going to be even bigger than that. So that's the size of the deficit in terms of billions. The next chart shows the deficit as a share of GDP, peaking at just under 12% in 2021. Now, the government is aiming to eliminate the current fiscal deficit by 2028-29. I think it's highly unlikely they'll do that unless there is faster growth in the economy. And then the other thing to look at is the debt. Next slide shows the national debt in the UK. Many of you pinpointing that. And you can see that if we go back 20 years before the global financial crisis, the national debt in the UK was 37% of GDP. And the aim of the government was to keep it below 40. The financial crisis blew that out of the water with the bailouts and things. And then the pandemic again. And here's the key point to note. We've almost shifted to a high level of debt, a higher baseline level of debt. We're not the only country. United States, Italy, Japan have higher debt than that, but it's a high level of debt. Now, the next chart I just wanted to show you, to get into a bit of context, is if you take all the government bonds in the world, all the bonds that have been issued by governments, and most governments borrow, truth be told, this is where they are. So, and this is worth just bearing in mind if you get a question tomorrow on US-China relationships. or globalization. We live in a global world, the global bond market, for example. Just under 40% of all the outstanding bonds that have not yet been repaid, are owed by the United States, of which, by the way, China has about 28% of all the US government debt. Japan has a huge amount of US government debt as well. UK, we have about 4% of all the world's bonds. Okay, Singapore and Hong Kong in a different place. So there is a huge amount of national debt, state debt in the world. The big issue really is, what does it cost to service the debt? So Japan has a very high national debt, 250% of GDP, but bond yields of less than 1%. We have a high national debt of 100% of GDP, but bond yields of 4%. So it costs the UK a much bigger percentage of our GDP to service that debt. £2 billion a week just on interest. There we go. That's our take on fiscal policy. Just moving on. I just want to quickly look at this issue because this is topical. Now, how, should the government try to cut the national debt as a share of GDP? Should that be an aim of policy? It's a great 25 marker. And how best to reduce the debt. So just very quickly, if it's okay with you, 2 minutes on this really key topic. If you get a question on how to reduce the debt, there are many ways, but by far the best way, by far the most effective way is point one, which is to grow the economy. If you grow the economy, you get more tax revenue. And secondly, the denominator, debt as a share of GDP, will go down, or goes up, sorry. So therefore, debt as a share of GDP must go down. So grow the economy. Secondly, allow slightly higher inflation. Maybe the government won't be too unhappy with inflation at 2.5%, 3%, because it brings the real value of debt down. The third option is to go down the kind of Osborne-esque fiscal austerity pathway. We've been there before. Or to really target welfare. So raise the state pension age, make it much harder to claim benefits, targeted measures to bring down any inactivity. A fifth way is to continue to freeze allowances. So the government is getting tens of £billions a year extra by not increasing tax allowances each year. So that you can earn £12,570 before you pay tax, and that you can earn up to £50,000 before you start paying 40% tax. So that holding those allowances down, they're frozen until 2029, is really bringing in tax revenue, sometimes called the hidden tax. You can raise some taxes, such as national insurance, which the government's done, or you can widen taxes, so broaden the base of tax, bring new things into tax, reform council tax, obviously school fees, vaping tax comes in next year, a tax on robots, whatever it is. You can maybe create some new taxes. Or you can really go after tax avoidance and tax evasion, which is a tough gig, particularly legal tax avoidance among multinationals. So there are some policies there for trying to reduce the debt. I've no doubt, by the way, that cutting the national debt is an important policy aim. The issue is, how do you do it? And the obvious ways to do it are to allow higher inflation or to grow the economy, which then links us to supply side policies. Okay, enough from me. Let's just pause here. Jim's in the production team. Thank you for giving it a Sunday morning, Jim. If you have any questions on fiscal policy, let's take 3 or 4 questions. Henry, is Rachel Reev's limited fiscal headroom detrimental? Good question, Henry. I suspect the answer is yes, because the UK economy can sustain a high level of borrowing to fund investment. There was actually a nice micro paper 1 question on infrastructure on EdExcel last week. So I'm pretty sure that she will want to borrow more to fund really key investments, particularly in the areas of transport and housing and energy. So it does act as a barrier. Ultimately, the biggest barrier is the bond market. And if they think she's borrowing too much, bond yields go up. I think what Reeves is hoping to do is to get more individuals to invest in shares, stocks and shares, by reforming ISAs. That takes a long time to do. It just makes sense, I think, to target an increase in borrowing to fund investment. Question from Alex here. Geoff, how accurate do we need to be with data? 140 billion rather than 136. Alex, great question. Don't worry about that tomorrow. If you're within the right ballpark, you'll be absolutely fine. No examiner, self included, is going to balk at any tiny inaccuracies like that. As long as you're in roughly this, we apply what's called a common sense marking approach. If you get it slightly wrong in the exam, it doesn't matter at all. Can an evaluation for fiscal policy increasing taxation with the Labour government currently isn't going to change income tax? How long is that going to be the case? Yeah, I mean, in theory, the government's committed to keeping tax rates the same, which they think boosts confidence. It's a bit like forward easing forward policy and monetary policy, pre-announcing interest rates. Does it boost confidence? Probably does if businesses know what taxes are going to be, but so many other things are uncertain globally that pre-committing to keeping taxes the same doesn't have much effect, and it does hold the government back. Anna says, can you explain fiscal drag? Yeah, happily. So the government has decided to fix allowances, to freeze allowances. The amount of money you earn before you pay tax is frozen. The amount of income you can earn before you move into the top tax is frozen. So anybody earning above £12,500 a year is now paying tax at 20% and national insurance at 12%, so 32%. Now, with inflation and with more people in work, you end up paying more. You end up earning more money, Anna, and therefore you start paying tax, either at 20% or 40 or 45%. So if you freeze allowances as the economy grows, people earn more, because of inflation. They end up paying a lot more in tax. So you have a lot of people now paying tax at 40% marginal rate, who wouldn't otherwise be anywhere near 40% tax rate. They'd be at 20% tax rate. Okay. Fiona, how do automatic stabilizers compare to discretionary? Great question. Fiona, the data I've seen from the OECD suggests that the full automatic stabilizers help reduce the volatility of the cycle by somewhere between 10% and 20%. So they don't prevent a recession if a recession is coming, but they can mitigate the consequences of recession. So fiscal stabilizers do help to just smooth the economic cycle a little bit and prevent the downside. Great stuff. Let's move on to monetary policy. Conscious of time here. Let's over to you, our amazing student audience. So we know the bank's cutting interest rates. So what are some of the arguments for and against the Bank of England really going ahead with this, cutting rates aggressively? Over to you. Economics of interest rate cuts. Over to the group. So you can look about whether it will work or what some of the consequences will be. So Ben talks about the risk of demand for inflation. Thanks, Ben. And that would draw a hint at a nice diagram to draw. Sam makes a great point about the housing market. Yeah, are you precipitating another bubble in the housing market? ADZ talks about the impact on the pound. Excellent. Always good to bring the exchange rate in there. Thank you. Some great answers, by the way. It's hard to keep up on the chat window. Yep, so Evie talks about cheaper borrowing costs helping businesses to invest. That's good. And H, hot money flows out of the economy. However, it's likely to stimulate consumption and investment, but won't be sustained. Okay, so monetary stimulus is really designed to kickstart short-term growth, isn't it, really, I guess? Quite a few of you talk about the impact on savers, which is excellent. Really, really good. A lot of you talking about demand for houses. Zeph, thank you to Zeph. Interest rates may not be effective in stimulating consumption and investment as confidence is low, potentially risking a liquidity trap. I think that was certainly the case, Zeph, if we go back in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. My instinct is that having gone up to 5.5%, cutting them from that level should have some traction. People will notice. I got a note from my bank manager the other day saying that my mortgage cost was coming down and I was saving X pounds a month. That was a nice little bonus. JT Galaxy, against cost of living crisis, low consumer confidence, worries over fiscal policy. Yep, increasing taxes will mean lower interest rates will not stimulate AD as predicted. Yeah, interestingly, that's a great point from JT, that if you're cutting interest rates when taxes are going up, the net effect And it's worth noting, by the way, that monetary and fiscal policy don't operate in isolation. Okay, they don't treat them as separate policies tomorrow. There are links there. Some really good stuff. Monty saying that my debt was outstanding. Geoff, classic indeed. Well, quickly, my thoughts on monetary policy. At the moment, the Bank of England is following a very cautious strategy. Risk averse is a nice phrase to use in the exam tomorrow. As we'll see in a second, the ECB and the 19 countries members of the European single currency have been much more proactive in cutting rates. Part of the reason for the caution of the MPC is that inflation is still above target. What they're also doing, of course, is reducing quantitative easing. So they've gone down from 895 billion to 620 by allowing bonds just to mature. The tariffs obviously have introduced a lot of uncertainty when you're setting interest rates. Where next for the world economy? What about the impacts on inflation or deflation? A lot of people are saying the Bank of England is behind the curve. It's a risk-averse, cautious central bank. And the risk is that not cutting rates to 4% quickly will hold back GDP growth this year. That said, although the base rate might come down, market interest rates, bond yields, bank loans, overdrafts, and credit cards are really expensive. Mortgages are much more expensive than they were 2 or 3 years ago, and that risks hitting spending power. A couple of people saying, what's the liquidity trap? Which is where cutting interest rates doesn't really have an effect on demand because people don't have the confidence to spend, or maybe they've got so much debt they don't want to take on any more debt. By the way, huge thanks to our team of students in the chat window helping to answer other people's questions. A few charts of monetary policy for you. This is the first chart, shows inflation and interest rates. Inflation there in blue. Disinflation, of course, in the last couple of years. Base rates going up and continuing to go up even though inflation was coming down. So in that sense, there are some lags that you might want to think about here. A lot of people thinking the Bank of England should have been cutting interest rates a little bit quicker. They've been reluctant to cut interest rates, and they've only moved very gently. The next slide actually is quite interesting. It shows the Bank of England, the ECB and the Fed, the base rates, and you can see there the USA and the Fed and the Bank of England more or less in tune on base rates. The ECB cutting interest rates quite sharply. Interest rates in the European Union are already down to 2.5%. The next slide, just a bit of background here, this is in case these charts come up. Mortgage rates. Yeah, I've got a feeling mortgage rates could well be an important sort of macro question, that we've moved from a period of very low interest rates. Your mortgage, take off inflation, your mortgage is basically zero. But then suddenly we went to 4.5%, 5%. So the last 2 or 3 years has been a big rise in mortgage interest rates. Now the key line to follow is the green line. Okay, why? Because I've got a 2-year variable rate. That's why. So that is the line I follow. I wake up every morning and see where that line is heading. The other chart which is worth noting is, this is great evaluation, is the next slide showing credit card interest rates. So you've got the blue line showing base rate set by the Bank of England, but most interest rates are not set by the Bank of England. They're set by the markets. That is a great bit of evaluation for you tomorrow if you get a question on this. The base rate might be falling, but the cost of credit card debt continues to climb. Go back just before the financial crisis, the average credit card interest rate was 15%. It's now up to 25%. So if you've got credit card debt and you don't pay it off each month, it is very, very expensive. And there's good evaluation. The other chart I wanted to show you. Oh, so here's Mia's point. Yep. Can higher mortgage rates encourage sustainable borrowing and spending? Yes, I think so. I mean, I think they had to go up anyway because we had to move away from that period of unrealistically low interest rates. But it's been a huge shock to the housing market, and particularly to millions of people who have to remortgage. Suddenly their mortgage expenses have gone up by several £100s a month. Many of those people don't have the income to necessarily or pay that, or have to cut back on something else. The other chart is worth showing is quantitative easing. So the Bank of England for many, many years was buying assets. It reached 895 billion in the autumn of 2020. Since then, they've gone for quantitative tightening. Don't worry about that. Just means they've allowed bonds to mature, and they just haven't bought any more bonds from the banks. So it's now down to 695. And I think one more slide. Let's have a quick look. No, okay, let's pause for questions. So Jim will pick out 3 or 4 questions on monetary policy, and then we'll finish off with supply side. Ruben says, is it worth revising financial markets? Absolutely. We actually have a brilliant, I think we've got about 50, 60 seconds shorts on financial economics. That, if you want to binge watch that this afternoon, that'd be great. Any questions on monetary policy before we look at the supply side? Does the Bank of England have any mechanisms to enforce the market follows the trend rate base rate? Yes, it does. It technically it could enforce a base rate change on financial markets. It hasn't done for decades. It doesn't need to, because financial markets set their own interest rates. Financial markets understand the role of the Bank of England as lender of last resort. If the Bank of England signals a rise in base rates, then most agents in the market follow that change. They don't have to, because there's competition in the market, but over time they do, because the institutions in the Bank of England recognise the value of mutual cooperation. What's stopping markets keeping rates high? Well, the signal sent to them by the central bank. The central bank sends the signal for the base rate of interest. Okay. Lots of questions coming through. Why are credit card interest rates so high? Great question. I think in part it's risk-averse behaviour by credit card companies. Secondly, the demand for credit card interest is interest inelastic. So you can raise interest rates because people still borrow money. Thirdly, the monopoly power of the credit card companies. A lot of behavioural economics involved here. But essentially it's the risk of default has gone up because of high household debt. And so therefore you pay a high price for your credit card interest rate. The solution, if you can, is not to take out credit card debt. It's very hard for people. What is most significant from will? Quantitative easing or interest rates? No question. There's no question that base rates are more important. Quantitative easing on its own stimulated the supply of liquidity in the banking system. Clearly that was important. And it probably brought long-term interest rates down by 1% or so. But what matters for most people is the base rate of interest, which feeds into things like mortgage rates and market rates. That's the most important point. Do I think base rates should be lower? Yes, I think they should be closer to 4%. I'm not too worried about it, but I think the Bank of England will move in the second half of the year with interest rates of somewhere between 3.5% and 4% by the end of next year. But by that time, you'll have taken paper 2. Can we get questions on quantitative tightening? Unlikely. It does not actually appear on the spec, whereas quantitative easing does. Let's move on to our final topic today, everybody. Conscious of time, supply side. Now, I think this is perhaps the most important 10 minutes of all of my live streams this year. Quick overview. The supply side weaknesses of the economy are pretty well known. Back in 2020, we were 20th in the World Competitiveness Rankings published by the World Economic Forum. We're now 28th, although we were 29th the year before, so upper place. We're doing better on PISA rankings and educational scores, 14th overall in 2022. The new data comes out next year. Singapore and Taiwan, unsurprisingly, come top, especially in maths. We have a big productivity gap, which I'll show you in a second. USA and Germany well ahead. Our investments are very low as a share of GDP, 17%, which is way below other commensurate countries. Better news on R&D. In the last 10 years, the UK has injected a lot more R&D, in particular from foreign direct investment, although that is at risk now as our universities come under financial pressure. We run a persistent current account deficit, which is a sign of supply side weakness. We have a lot of economic inactivity, and the government is trying to build new homes, but house building is the undersupply is well below what it needs to be. And Ankit says, what's the best developing country research? It's up to you. You choose what you want to research for the exam. We've actually just published 10 90-second shorts which cover a variety of developing countries, and they're on TikTok. Okay, so PISA ranking, thank you, Stardim, is the International Standard Attainment Test for English, Maths and Reasoning. They're standardized tests which signify human capital. Let's move on. Here's a chart showing competitiveness. Now, we were 20th 3 or 4 years ago. These are the rankings in the various components. So we come 64th when it comes to inflation. That's no surprise in 2023. And again, if we're lower than 20th, it's kind of underperforming. If we're better than 20th, we're doing slightly better. So we're 12th for international investment, good on FDI, we're 13th for finance, but we're 44th for basic infrastructure. So our infrastructure is perceived as a weakness in this peer review. Okay. Another slide shows the underinvestment. Follow the red line there. This is public and private sector investment as a share of GDP, with the other G7 countries shaded there. So the other G7 countries, including Japan, Germany, United States. And you can see the red line is pretty much at the bottom. So for many, many, many years, we have tended to invest less as a share of our GDP. We've overconsumed, underinvested. And that then links to the next slide, which shows the productivity gap. And there are different ways of measuring this, but I use output per worker relative to the UK. So in 2021, the United States had output per worker nearly 50% higher. The French 17% higher. Most countries just ahead of us, not to a massive extent, but the gap with the States is huge. So our productivity is low in relative terms. And the next slide shows, and this is really interesting. So this shows GDP per hour worked. Now follow the red line, that's what actually happened. Okay, and you can see that the dotted line is the trend from 1979 to the end of 2023. And you can see what's happened. Okay, productivity growth in the UK has fallen off a cliff in that sense. It's just stopped growing, output per hour. And here's the stat to take into the exam. If productivity had grown in line with the pre-crisis trend before the global financial crisis, it would now be 25% higher. And that would translate into higher incomes, higher tax revenues, more government spending. Okay, so our productivity growth has essentially stopped growing. And there are big issues for this. It's one of the fundamental supply side policies. Okay. Well, I've got hope for you, Mariama. I've got hope. Okay, the UK is not finished. Moving on. So this next 2 or 3 minutes is incredibly important. So if you're still with us, the 1,200 of you are. So here we go. If you get a question on supply side policies, which is highly likely, it doesn't have to be UK, it could be other countries as well, please avoid, if you can, generic answers. A phrase such as, the government could spend more on education and training. And there's nothing wrong with that statement, but it's not going to get you the mark you need. Please be specific. Please try to provide detail, because the more detail you provide in this area, that then opens the door to better analysis and stronger evaluation. Okay? And that's true, by the way, for all exam boards, OCR, EdXL, AQA, WJSC. Okay? So next slide. And I'd be really interested in what you can come up with in the next 60 seconds. Can you please be specific with examples of current supply side policies brought in by the UK government? 60-second blitz. Let's have a go. Keep an eye on the chat window, everybody. Lots of great policies incoming. Thank you, Anna. Yep. Third runway. Anna's made a start. That is something specific. Okay. Connor, lifelong learning entitlement. Absolutely. That is really good, Connor. Thank you for that. Because that invites a discussion about whether that's better than under 18 apprenticeships, for example. And the contract for difference to incentivize innovation in renewables. That is an amazing detailed policy. Thank you. Excellent there from Jasmine. The funding that goes into the new engineering apprenticeships. Well done. We'll bring in a few more. Matty talks about the link between Oxford and Cambridge. Yeah. Although, Matty, transport would only go one way, wouldn't it? It would go from Oxford to Cambridge. Nobody in their right mind would head in the opposite direction. Yeah, a lot of you talking about apprenticeship levies. Really good. The more specific, can we put a few more up on the screen? Silvertown Tunnel, really good. Excellent there from Evie. Yeah, really good stuff. I've got a few examples for you, but let's see what we can come up with. The Thames Tideway Tunnel I mentioned, IET Jubilee Scholarship Programme, Milo there. That is a really granular level of detail from Milo, which is what we're looking for. Okay, Tilly Baines, the Wisley interchange of the M25. Yep, wow. So this is good content. Subsidies for STEM teachers. Yeah, really good. Really, really good. I'm just trying to keep it on the chat window here. Youth mobility scheme with the EU would be a very good one. Yeah, excellent. Natalie talking about industrial policy in the computer chip industry. Hannah, 30 hours of childcare paid for the government. Yeah, really good. The issue there, Hannah, of course, is that the costs for lots of these childcare companies have gone up. Louis talks about the roundabout at Hexham on the A69, which I know well. I love that roundabout. Okay. I love that roundabout. In fact, I can spend half an hour going around it and then before we turn off and go to Starbucks. Sanders talks the Manchester Metro link. Excellent. You get the idea, everybody. Brilliant. Okay, let's think about what have I gone with. These are some of the big ones. Again, you can download this presentation straight after today. So if you don't want to, Nick Balfour talks about Great British Energy, insulation schemes, all that kind of stuff. So thank you to Nick for that. Yeah, the government set up GBE, state-owned industry, state-owned business, which is trying to accelerate the development of clean air, offshore wind, hydrogen, and modular nuclear. The housing planning reforms, what are we talking about? Deregulating and planning permissions, new garden cities, for example, Ebbsfleet Garden City. They're trying to build 1.5 million new homes. It's going to be a tough gig. It can be done. They've brought down the minimum length of an apprenticeship from 12 to 8 months, so shorter apprenticeships, and also more funding, as people mentioned, for small businesses. Full expensing. Businesses can now deduct the full cost of investments in plant and equipment. New investment zones, including the West Midlands and Greater Manchester. And then the infrastructure. Trans-Pennine Route, HS2 to a Euston station, East Anglia offshore wind farms, the Eastern Green Link from Scotland down to the northeast, linking Scottish off-coast renewables to northeast investment in battery technology. Anna talked about Heathrow third runway, 9 new reservoirs. We haven't built a new reservoir since Kielder Water in the early 80s. Most of those reservoirs in the south. And then obviously work visa policies. But that's a slight issue there. The government is trying to tweak work visas to make it harder for non-graduates to come in. Either way, everybody, here's the point. The more specific you can be, the better. And hopefully these and the great answers in the chat window have brought in. And nationalisation has brought in some great ideas there. Thank you. Next slide. Does the nationalisation also count? Yes. Because what you're doing there, Daisy, you're preventing the hysteresis, you're preventing the loss of some physical capacity. And of course, that should involve investment in the new green smelting plants at Scunthorpe, which could be a long-term investment. So yes. Okay. So moving on, almost there, everybody. Pardon me. 2 signs of hope. One is AI. So, I mean, it could well be the case that AI could be a catalyst for faster growth. My good friend Matt Clifford has just published a report, and I want to give you 4 of his points about AI in the UK. And it could well be the case that AI could be a catalyst. I know there are downsides, environmental issues. I'll be doing some work on AI, by the way, for the synoptic paper after half term. But here are 4 reasons why AI could be growth enhancing. First of all, it could help close that productivity gap. Automation of repetitive tasks, in particular, for example, AI tools in healthcare, streaming diagnosis processes and things, and getting people treatment earlier. It does create demand for new jobs. Some of you will have written about that, I think, in the micro paper. Data scientists, prompt engineers, that kind of stuff. In theory, it could be a catalyst for regional regeneration, post-industrial regions. So innovation hubs, gigafactories, that kind of stuff. And if we can develop a scaled comparative advantage in AI, then the UK can both attract FDI and export AI technologies and perhaps position itself as a hub for global AI innovation. And that is my hope, really. When I've now retired from full-time teaching, that is my hope for the UK, really going forward. I see so many of my students moving into this kind of area. Mia makes a really good point about environmental trade-offs and structural employment. Mia, thank you. That's perfect evaluation if this kind of topic comes up. Okay. And the other issue, I think, is Europe. And let's finish with this slide. Our future relation with the European Union is crucial. Now, we're starting to see that the summit, obviously, tomorrow is going to be too late for your exam, but the launch of the youth mobility scheme. I think could be an important moment. The government is clear. Britain will stay outside the EU. There will be no return to the single market or the customs union or freedom of movement. Fine, that's a political decision. But the National Institute's forecast, which I'm showing on the screen there, that by 2035, by which time A-levels will be a distant memory, but in 10 years' time, the economy will be 6% smaller than it might otherwise have been, without Brexit. So the cumulative effects of Brexit starting to show through now in terms of businesses stopping exporting and the impact on labour flows. Brexit is costing the UK a lot. It was a decision taken 10 years ago. You know my views on Brexit. I think we should be back inside the single market. I think we should be reintroducing youth mobility yesterday rather than tomorrow. But the elephant in the room is our trade relationships with the European Union and also with other countries as well on the supply side. There we go. I said we'd do 45 minutes. We have spent, and thank you, we've done 45 minutes of your time the day before the exam. I just wanted to go through key policies, fiscal, monetary, supply side. If you found it useful, consider pressing the like button so the algorithm finds other students today. I think, hopefully, I've written down 3 or 4 really key points here from the contributions just from the chat window. Ideas that I need to go away and think about in my own teaching. So the idea today was just give you a top-up ahead of the macro paper tomorrow. Now, tomorrow morning, 9:30, if you want to join us for 20 minutes, no more than that, we've got some multiple choice questions and some calculation questions, just as a little gentle breakfast with the tutor team tomorrow. Okay? Ahead of your macro paper. I know some of you have got sociology in the morning. Good luck with that. Huge thanks. We've got nearly 1,200 people in the live stream still at the end of our session. Appearing on a Sunday morning takes a lot of effort. You've got a lot of things you want to do. Big thanks to Jim in particular and the production team for making this run so smoothly. Have a great day to everybody. Keep working hard. Stay calm. Stay positive. You'll be fine in the macro paper tomorrow. Don't forget to use the data in the extracts. The data response questions, all you need is the data in the extracts. In the essays, yes, you have to bring in some of your own wider knowledge. That's part of the exam. I'm sure you do that really well. As always, take care, stay safe, stay happy, stay curious, and see you sometime soon.